The Wyoming backcountry was still coated in frost that early spring morning when ranch worker Eli Turner heard an unusual sound. Echoing across the wind-swept canyon was a desperate whinny. Shrill, panicked, and heart-wrenching. Eli, who worked at the Frost Ridge Ranch, paused mid-task, his ears straining toward the noise. Grabbing his gloves and climbing into his dusty Ford pickup, he followed the sound deeper into the backcountry trails, his boots crunching on frozen brush. What he found shattered his heart. A newborn Mustang foal, barely hours old, standing unsteadily beside the lifeless body of its mother. The mare had clearly died during labor, leaving the fragile colt trembling and alone in the cold. The foal's golden coat was already matted with dirt and birth fluids, and it shivered violently with each gust of wind. Eli knelt beside the tiny creature, his voice soft but firm. "Easy now, little guy. You're not alone anymore." Eli knew the foal had no real chance of surviving on its own. He lived alone in a remote log cabin nestled deep in the forest, accompanied only by his 3 loyal dogs: Max, a German Shepherd; Daisy, a Golden Retriever; and Finn, a blue heeler with a stubborn streak. Without hesitation, Eli gently lifted the foal, lighter than a hay bale, and laid it across the back seat of his truck. As the truck rumbled back toward the cabin, Eli kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching the foal's chest rise and fall. He didn't yet know that his decision that day would change not just the colt's life, but his and that of his entire animal family, forever. Back at Eli Turner's secluded log cabin, nestled beneath the towering pines of northwestern Wyoming, the arrival of the foal sparked immediate curiosity and a little chaos. As Eli carefully carried the small Mustang into the barn, his 3 dogs scrambled to investigate. Max, the alert and loyal German Shepherd, barked a few short warnings before sniffing the air with suspicion. Daisy, always gentle, wagged her tail eagerly. Finn tilted his head, unsure what to make of this long-legged stranger. Eli laid the foal gently on a blanket in a warm corner of the barn and began preparing a milk formula in an old bottle he'd used years ago to feed an orphaned calf. The foal, still weak and trembling, gave a soft, breathy nicker and attempted to stand, collapsing again into the bedding. Max was the first to approach, his instincts honed by years of guarding livestock. He gently began licking the foal's damp coat, the way he might groom a newborn pup. Daisy lay down next to the colt, sharing her warmth without hesitation. Finn, ever the protector, stood watch at the barn door, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Eli stood back, watching in awe. Something special was already unfolding. These dogs didn't just accept the colt, they were welcoming him. The foal, still dazed by the world around him, responded instinctively. He nestled close to Daisy, sighing softly, comforted by the canine warmth surrounding him. Eli smiled and whispered, "Well, buddy, looks like you just found yourself a family." Over the next few days, Eli fed the foal every few hours, and the dogs remained by its side constantly. He decided to name the colt Ranger, after the bright white blaze on his forehead that reminded him of a mountain scout's mark. Ranger wasn't just surviving, he was beginning to thrive. Within just a few weeks, the change in Ranger was astonishing. Though still wobbly on his legs, the foal followed his new dog siblings everywhere. Eli had fenced off a large section of the pasture for Ranger to explore safely, but the young colt rarely wandered without his pack. Wherever Max, Daisy, and Finn went, Ranger was right behind, mimicking every move, trying to understand his place in this strange new world. What truly stunned Eli was the behavior that began to emerge. It started one afternoon when a delivery truck approached the gate. As usual, the dogs rushed to the fence, barking ferociously. But this time, Ranger lifted his head and let out a strange sound, a rough mix between a nicker and a bark. A bark neigh. Eli laughed so hard he dropped the hay bale he was carrying. "You've got to be kidding me," he said aloud, wiping tears from his eyes. It didn't stop there. When the dogs sat to wait for their food, Ranger stood beside them, nudging Eli's side for his bottle. During playtime, when Eli threw tennis balls into the field, Ranger galloped after them, not quite catching them in his mouth, but giving it a valiant effort. Sometimes, he'd even drop a ball at Eli's boots, then back up and wait, his eyes wide with excitement. At night, instead of standing or curling in the straw like a horse normally would, Ranger would lie down between Daisy and Max, folding his long legs awkwardly underneath him, sighing with contentment. Finn usually curled up near Ranger's head, as if guarding the young Mustang's dreams. Eli couldn't believe what he was witnessing. "This horse doesn't think he's a horse," he muttered one evening. "He thinks he's a dog." By the time Ranger was 3 months old, it was obvious to everyone who met him. This colt wasn't just imitating dog behavior. He truly believed he was part of the pack. His movements were a bizarre mix of coltish clumsiness and canine mimicry. When Max lifted his leg to mark a fence post, Ranger tried to do the same, only to nearly topple over. Eli had to stop what he was doing and steady the foal before he hurt himself. "Easy, buddy. You've got 4 legs and none of them bend that way." Eli chuckled. But Ranger didn't give up. Eventually, he invented his own version, raising one front leg in a stiff, awkward pose whenever the dogs did their business. It didn't serve any functional purpose, but the dogs seemed to accept it as a valid form of pack behavior. Ranger was adapting in his own special way. Visitors to the Frost Ridge Ranch were equal parts confused and charmed. When Eli's niece, Lindsay, came to visit from Bozeman, she gasped with laughter watching Ranger chase tennis balls and try to sit like Max. "He thinks he's a golden retriever," she said, filming the foal with her phone. "You have to post this, Uncle Eli. This is internet gold." Eli smiled but shook his head. "He's more than a funny video. He's got a soul bigger than this whole valley." The local vet, Dr. Natalie Brooks, took a deeper interest. She had been checking on Ranger since he was rescued, but now she was documenting his behavior. "What you're seeing is full species imprinting," she explained to Eli. "He's not pretending to be a dog. In his mind, he is one. These behaviors aren't just mimicry, they're his identity." Eli nodded, looking out at Ranger, who was now pawing at the ground alongside Finn, warning off a low-flying hawk. "Whatever he is," Eli said, "he's family." At 6 months old, Ranger had grown significantly in size but not in self-awareness. Despite now being taller than all 3 of his canine siblings combined, he still tried to squeeze into the same old doghouse during summer thunderstorms. The image was pure comedy. A lanky young Mustang with his head jammed inside the wooden doghouse, the rest of his body sticking out like a mismatched puzzle piece. Eli couldn't help but laugh every time he passed by. "You're gonna need a bigger house, pal," he joked. But while Ranger's antics were endearing, they were also strangely functional. He had adopted nearly every behavior of his dog family, from their morning patrols to their playful games. When Eli opened the barn doors at sunrise, all 4 animals would rush outside. Max would take the lead, trotting toward the perimeter fence. Daisy and Finn followed close behind, and Ranger galloped right with them, snorting and attempting his now signature front leg lift at each post. It didn't matter that it made no sense. To Ranger, this was what pack members did. And being a pack member meant doing your part. His protective instincts were just as strong. When the UPS truck rolled up the long gravel driveway, Ranger was the first to reach the gate. He pawed at the ground, gave a forceful snort bark, and stood firm beside Max, Daisy, and Finn. The delivery driver, a man named Terry Collins, had grown used to the sight. "That's the only horse I've ever seen that acts like a Rottweiler," he'd laugh. He even started bringing a pocket full of dog treats, one for each of the dogs, and a special apple-flavored one for Ranger, who had learned to sit awkwardly on his haunches like Max whenever he wanted a snack. Eli had to admit it was bizarre, but it worked. Every creature on his ranch knew where they belonged. And Ranger? He belonged to the dogs, not just in behavior but in spirit. Eli had always known that one day, Ranger would meet real horses, and he wasn't sure what would happen when that time came. He had delayed introducing the young Mustang to other equines, afraid that the encounter might confuse or distress him. But fate had other plans. One afternoon, while Ranger was grazing with Max, Daisy, and Finn along the far fence line, a herd of wild mustangs appeared on the ridge. There were 12 in total, rugged, majestic, untamed creatures, led by a dominant bay stallion with a black mane and fire in his eyes. The moment Ranger spotted them, he froze. His ears shot forward, nostrils flaring. The herd noticed him, too, especially the stallion, who began walking toward the fence with slow, measured steps. Ranger looked to Max, unsure. The dogs barked, alert and suspicious of the strangers. And right on cue, Ranger joined in. His voice a strange, rough blend of bark and nicker. He pawed the ground beside the dogs, signaling his loyalty. To him, these new horses weren't familiar. They were intruders. The bay stallion stopped several feet away, puzzled by the scent and sounds coming from what should have been one of his own. His ears flicked. He let out a low nicker, but Ranger didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Finn and let out a confused whine. The dogs sensed his anxiety and immediately formed a triangle around him. Max at the front, Daisy and Finn at his sides. Protective. Alert. A younger mare from the wild herd stepped forward to investigate, stretching her neck to sniff Ranger in greeting. But Ranger, unfamiliar with horse etiquette, turned and tried to sniff her back. Specifically, the way dogs do, directly at her hind end. The mare squealed in protest, pinned her ears, and backed away fast. Ranger jumped behind Max, startled and embarrassed, peeking out with wide, uncertain eyes. It was the first time Ranger had felt different, and it shook him. The days following the Mustang encounter were unusually quiet at Frost Ridge Ranch. Ranger was no longer galloping with the same carefree bounce. Instead, he spent long hours standing alone near the back fence, staring toward the distant ridgeline where the wild horses had disappeared. He didn't bark. He didn't chase balls. He barely responded when Eli called him in for feeding. Eli noticed the change instantly. So did the dogs. Max remained close, often lying beside Ranger in the grass. Daisy would nudge him gently with her nose, trying to coax him into play. Even Finn brought over his favorite chew toy, a frayed rope he normally guarded like treasure, and dropped it at Ranger's hooves. But Ranger didn't move. His mind was elsewhere. At night, he still curled up beside his pack, but his eyes stayed open long after the others had fallen asleep. He would occasionally lift his head and make quiet, awkward vocalizations, strange half-whinnies that sounded like they came from a horse trying to remember who he was. Dr. Natalie Brooks came out to the ranch again when Eli called her with concern. "He's confused," she said gently, resting a hand on Ranger's mane. "His identity is cracking open. That encounter awakened something instinctive, but he doesn't understand it. He's emotionally caught between two worlds." Eli sighed, watching the colt chew a blade of grass half-heartedly. "So what do we do? He doesn't fit with them. But now he doesn't fit here either." Dr. Brooks thought for a moment. "We help him build a bridge." And just like that, the plan for Ranger's next chapter began to take shape. A week later, a new figure arrived at Frost Ridge Ranch. His name was Gentle Ben, a retired therapy horse with a thick silver mane and soft, wise eyes. Ben had spent most of his life helping children with disabilities and veterans with trauma. He was calm, unshakable, and carried a sense of peace that could quiet any pasture. Dr. Brooks had arranged the visit, believing that Ben might be the guide Ranger needed. Not a rival, not a wild stranger, but a patient teacher who spoke fluent horse without judgment. Ranger was curious the moment Ben stepped off the trailer. But instead of barking or hiding, he approached with his usual dog-like greeting, lowering his front end into a play bow and letting out a soft bark nicker. Ben didn't flinch. He simply dipped his head slowly in a classic equine greeting, then stood still, waiting. Ranger tilted his head. No rejection, no fear. Over the next several days, the two horses spent more time together. Ben didn't force anything. He just existed nearby, grazing when Ranger grazed, standing when Ranger stood, resting when Ranger rested. Slowly, Ranger began to mimic Ben's body language. He started nuzzling instead of sniffing, walking alongside instead of circling like a dog. When Ben nickered for breakfast one morning, Ranger tried to copy the sound. Came out awkward and strained, but it was his first real horse vocalization. Eli stood at the barn doorway, arms crossed, heart heavy and hopeful. The dogs watched too, heads tilted, tails wagging. They didn't seem threatened. If anything, they seemed proud. Ranger was learning a new language. Not to replace his first one, but to add to it. For the first time, he wasn't a horse pretending to be a dog. He was something else entirely. Something in between. And that made him extraordinary. Word of Ranger's unique behavior began to spread beyond the quiet valleys of Frost Ridge Ranch. Videos of the dog horse fetching tennis balls, playing tug-of-war, and following canine commands circulated online. But it was a clip of Ranger gently grooming Gentle Ben's neck, then turning to curl up beside Max and Daisy in the barn, that caught the attention of someone unexpected. Dr. Ellen Martinez, director of a wild horse sanctuary in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The sanctuary was struggling to help a group of orphaned foals, young mustangs who had lost their mothers and refused to bond with adult horses. They were scared, withdrawn, and resistant to therapy. Dr. Martinez saw Ranger's videos and had a thought. What if this strange, cross-species colt could reach them in a way no ordinary horse could? She contacted Eli with a heartfelt proposal. A trial stay for Ranger, along with Gentle Ben as emotional support. Eli hesitated. Ranger was family, but Dr. Brooks gently encouraged him. You wouldn't be sending him away, she said. You'd be letting him step into who he was meant to be. And so, with tears in his eyes, Eli loaded Ranger and Gentle Ben into a trailer. The dogs rode behind in his truck, their noses pressed to the rear window the entire journey. The sanctuary was a vast, quiet place surrounded by mountains. The foals were hesitant at first until Ranger made his move. Instead of approaching like a horse, he trotted over and dropped a stick at the hooves of the smallest foal, then flopped onto his back in a full dog-style wiggle. The other foals blinked. One stepped closer, then another, and just like that, the ice began to melt. Over the next few days, Ranger worked miracles. He played, he nuzzled, he shared hay by dropping mouthfuls near the more timid foals. He didn't just teach them horse behavior, he taught them to trust. To the astonishment of the staff, Ranger was doing what no therapist or surrogate mare had been able to do. He was reaching broken hearts by being exactly who he was. After 3 remarkable months at the sanctuary, Ranger had transformed the rehabilitation program. 12 orphaned foals had bonded, begun socializing, and even started learning proper horse behaviors. From a Mustang who had grown up thinking he was a dog. But back at Frost Ridge Ranch, trouble was brewing. Max, the loyal German shepherd who had first licked Ranger clean and welcomed him into the pack, was ill. His age had caught up with him faster than Eli expected. Arthritis had slowed his steps for a while, but now he barely moved at all and he had stopped eating. Eli made the call. Ranger had to come home. The moment Ranger stepped off the trailer, he let out a Barkney hybrid that echoed through the trees. From the porch, Max slowly raised his head. His tail gave a weak thump against the wood. Ranger trotted over and dropped to the ground beside him, curling around his canine mentor like a foal around its dam. He nuzzled Max's graying face, making soft whimpers and whinnies that blended together in a song of grief and reunion. For the next week, Ranger barely left Max's side. He brought him mouthfuls of soft hay and would stand guard at the barn door each night. Daisy and Finn joined the vigil, the pack quietly surrounding their elder. And then, one peaceful morning, Max didn't wake up. Eli buried him beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the pasture. Ranger stood beside the grave, his head bowed low, eyes distant. And then he let out a sound no one had ever heard before. A deep, aching, soulful cry. Not a bark, not a whinny, something entirely new. A sound that was all his own. That night, Ranger didn't curl up with the dogs. Instead, he stood by the pasture fence until the stars came out. Eli walked out and placed a hand on his shoulder. He taught you how to be part of something, he said quietly. Now it's your turn to lead. And from that moment on, Ranger did. After Max's passing, something shifted in Ranger. He didn't just follow anymore, he led. Each morning, he rose early and trotted along the fence line like Max used to, ears perked, scanning the horizon. Daisy and Finn followed his lead now, letting him take point on their daily patrol. Even the way Ranger carried himself had changed. Still playful, still uniquely Ranger, but now with purpose in every stride. The sanctuary soon called with an offer. They'd seen what Ranger could do, not just for horses but for people. They offered him a permanent role at their facility, along with a generous donation to Frost Ridge Ranch. But Eli hesitated. Ranger was more than a therapy horse. He was family. And after losing Max, Eli wasn't ready to lose him too. That's when Dr. Brooks stepped in with an idea. "Why send him away?" she asked. "When we can bring the healing here?" Together, they pitched a bold new project. A cross-species rehabilitation center, right at Frost Ridge Ranch. A place where traumatized horses, abandoned foals, and even struggling humans could come to heal. Ranger would be the heart of the program, with his dog siblings and Gentle Ben as part of the staff. The idea took root faster than anyone expected. In 6 months, the cross-species healing ranch opened its gates. The first residents included 3 orphaned foals and 2 horses rescued from neglect. Ranger greeted them all the same way, play bowing, dropping a stick at their hooves, then guiding them to meet Daisy and Finn. His mixed language, part bark, part whinny, part body wiggle, bridged gaps no one thought possible. Then came the program's first human client, 5-year-old Emma Morrison, a little girl left mute by a car accident. She was terrified of horses, but the moment Ranger dropped a tennis ball at her feet and lay down with his head tilted in invitation, she giggled. By the end of the session, she was laughing, tossing the ball and shouting, "Go get it, Ranger!" Her parents wept. Eli did too. What started as a single act of kindness in a cold Wyoming canyon had become something extraordinary. A place where being different wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. By the time Ranger turned 5, Frost Ridge Ranch had become a sanctuary not just for animals, but for souls. Veterans with PTSD, children with autism, and horses with trauma all came to find healing beneath the wide Wyoming sky. But the heart of it all was still Ranger, the dog-hearted horse with a bark in his whinny and a tennis ball in his teeth. Each session started the same. Ranger would lead the newcomers, 4-legged or 2, on a walk through the pasture. He'd pause to let them breathe, nudge them gently when they froze, and drop toys or hay or soft touches in their path like breadcrumbs toward healing. He'd lie down with foals who wouldn't eat. He'd roll over and show his belly to stallions who didn't trust. He'd trot beside children in wheelchairs and rest his head in their laps without being asked. He had become a master of language beyond words, a communicator of comfort. On one cool autumn evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the barn lights glowed golden, Eli stood watching Ranger teach a frightened mare how to play. Nearby, Buddy's grandpuppies yipped and tumbled, mimicking Ranger's exaggerated movements. Gentle Ben, now old and content, grazed in peace by the oak tree that shaded Max's grave. Scout, though stiff with age, still herded the youngest colts when needed, though Ranger had taken on most of the work. And just then, as if on cue, Ranger trotted up to Eli with a stick in his mouth, dropped it at his boots, and gave his signature bark neigh, a sound that had become the anthem of the ranch. Eli smiled, tears stinging his eyes. "You were never just a horse," he whispered. "You were always something more." Later that night, as Ranger curled up in the straw with Daisy and Finn beside him, Dr. Brooks wrote her final journal entry on his case. Her words would be published in journals and shared at veterinary conferences around the world. Ranger redefined what it means to belong. He was raised by dogs, healed like a human, and loved like family. He taught us that identity isn't confined by species, and that love, when given freely, transcends biology, instinct, and expectation. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Tell us in the comments about the animals who changed your life, because sometimes the ones who don't fit in are the ones who show us how to heal. Ranger's story is proof that being different isn't a weakness. It's a superpower.